Today's webinar is called Existing and Potential Threats, Exploring Established Pests and Pathogens and What's Next for Ontario's Forest. There are a variation of pests and pathogens, both native and non-native, that pose serious threats to the health of our forest. When they attack, the results can be deadly, and often they leave entirely altered ecosystems in their wake. Once established, invasive pests and pathogens are challenging and costly to control or eradicate. Early detection is critical for proper management. This session will be presented by forest health professionals from BioForest and Lallemand Plant Care. The presenters will explore some key native and non-native pathogens that are currently active in Ontario's urban and natural forest. They will also discuss a few that have not yet arrived but are waiting at our doorstep. They will describe what these pests look like, where they come from, how to identify them, and illustrate their impacts on Ontario's forest. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers, Allison Craig and Allison Wilmot. Go ahead whenever you're ready, guys.
Okay, great, thank you. So I just wanted to start our presentation today with thanking Forest Ontario for inviting us to this webinar. Speaking now, if you can see me, I'm Allison Windmill, and my co-worker Allison Craig will be coming online shortly, and we're going to be doing this presentation together. Okay, so I want to start off today just as an overview. So we're going to do a webinar today focused on the forest pests in Ontario. The pests we will discuss include both pests and pathogens, which affect at least one of the forest types in Ontario. We'll begin with covering the basic breakdowns of insects and disease, what constitutes as native, non-native, and invasive, and the overall impacts to the forests of Ontario. Our goal today is to present to you some of the most damaging pests in Ontario and educate you on their classification, biology, how to identify them through signs and symptoms, and their overall impacts on Ontario's forests. We split the insects that we will discuss into two categories, those that are not native and those which are but can reach outbreak levels. And then we will also cover three major diseases which also impact forest health in Ontario. Okay, so for the most part, insects can be categorized into one of 5 categories according to how they damage the trees. The insects that we will discuss today focus on defoliators and borers, but there's also sucking insects, mites, gall makers, root feeders, and other insects. So the defoliators, in a broad sense, they consume leaf tissue in a variety of ways, while borers do their damage under the bark. And so one is kind of doing external damage and the other one is doing internal damage. When we look at a disease, it typically requires 3 things. So we require a pathogen. The plant or the host must be susceptible to this pathogen, and the environment must also be suitable for the disease to develop. Okay, so we're going to be classifying the forest pests using 3 key terms. So we have native, which are indigenous species that have existed in Ontario for centuries. They're usually not a concern, and they typically play a key role in the ecosystem, performing some kinds of ecosystem services like pollination or recycling nutrients. And they can reach outbreak levels, but this is usually periodically or happen on like a cyclic level. We also have non-native, and so this means that species that have been introduced into the forest within the recent history, so they haven't been there for a long time. And both native and non-native species can reach invasive levels. And so what we mean by invasives are species that have spread beyond their range or increasing to damaging levels. And so at this time, when we call them invasive, they're typically causing some kind of ecological or economic damage, and this is when they become or are considered pests. Okay, so invasive and forest insects are a problem for all forest types, from the urban, commercial, and natural forests. They are spread largely in part by humans, making urban centers the prime location for an invasion to start. The urban forest increases property values, reduces energy costs for homes, improves air quality. There's a wide range of ecosystem services that they provide. And once an invasion takes hold, it can easily spread out into the natural and commercial forests. Our natural forests provide a vast quantity of environmental services as well as social values, and our commercial forest is a pivotal economic need for Canada. It provides a significant portion of our GDP as well as a significant amount of jobs for our local economy. All right, so we're going to start off our talk today with non-native insects, and Alison Craig is going to take it from here.
Awesome, thanks, Al. Okay, hi everybody. The first insect we're going to talk about today is the emerald ash borer. This is probably the hottest topic in terms of invasive species right now, in terms of the amount of damage it's causing and the cost that it is racking up. So we'll start with this one. Its Latin name is Agrylus planipennis, and this is a wood-boring insect. It's non-native and it's invasive. It's native originally to China and eastern parts of Asia. It's originally found in North America back in 2002. First, it was detected in the US, in Michigan, and then it was found in Ontario, in Windsor, just across the river from Detroit. It's believed that it arrived here in wood packing materials, wood shipping crates, wood pallets, things like this. This is a very common introduction pathway for invasive species, especially those that are wood boring. Host species, when we talk about host species, we're talking about the type of tree species that this particular insect attacked. So emerald ash borer host species are all ash. And there's 6 types of ash trees in Ontario, and all of them are susceptible. Since it arrived in Canada almost 20 years ago, it's now been confirmed and established in Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And it's also spread rapidly over a large area of the United States. So emerald ash borer biology, this is where we're going to talk about the life cycle of each of the pests. EAB in most parts of Ontario has a 1-year life cycle, meaning that it will go through one of these life cycles per year. So to start it off, we'll start with the eggs. EAB lays its eggs in the mid to late summer. They're very tiny, usually less than 1 millimeter in diameter, and they camouflage really nicely into the bark, so they're almost impossible to see with your eyes. Each female beetle will lay up to 100 eggs per season. Those eggs hatch and the larvae tunnel under the bark where they start to feed on the phloem tissue. And they create these long tunnels under the bark as they go along, feeding and maturing over the winter. This pest is so damaging because the larvae are feeding on the special conductive phloem tissue under the bark. And this is the part of the tree where the nutrients are transported. So these tunnels that are being created basically disrupt the flow of nutrients, and the tree can't feed itself. The larvae will pupate in the early spring, and then they transition into their beetle form. They emerge from under the bark as these tiny emerald green, that's where they get their name from, beetles. They're kind of bullet shaped, and you'll see them flying around throughout the summer. The beetles will feed on ash foliage, they mature and they mate, and then they lay their eggs and the cycle starts all over again. So there's many signs and symptoms that you can use to identify if emerald ash borer is present in an area. Just a quick differentiation, the difference between sign and symptom. A sign is direct evidence of this pest. So either the pest itself is present or there's some kind of direct evidence that it's there. And a symptom is used to refer to the tree's response to the pest attacking it. So 2 different things there when we're talking about signs and symptoms. Dieback and canopy thinning, loss of foliage in the tree canopy is a big one for emerald ash borer, and usually the one that's most evident. You can see this in terms of dead trees on the landscape, either individual trees or throughout a woodlot or a natural area. This is a symptom because the trees are dying in response to being attacked by emerald ash borer. Another common symptom is epicormic shoots, and you'll see that picture of it there. These green sprouts that grow directly out of the tree trunk. This indicates that the tree is under stress. A sign of emerald ash borer, so direct evidence, is these exit holes that they make when they bore through the bark. They're pretty unique because they look like sideways capital Ds. They're not very easy to see right away, but you can see them with your eyes, and the more you spot, the easier they become to find. Another symptom that is created is these vertical bark cracks running up and down the tree trunk or sometimes on large branches. And this is a response to the feeding that's happening underneath the bark. And finally, woodpecker feeding is another indicator that emerald ash borer might be in the area. You might see a woodpecker going to town on a tree, and that's because it senses that there's larvae underneath, so it's looking for food. In terms of impacts of emerald ash borer, 100% of trees, of ash trees that are attacked will die, so pretty severe mortality. And both healthy and stressed trees of all sizes are susceptible to EAB. It impacts urban, commercial, and natural forests. It's a very common street tree because it's very tolerant of harsh urban conditions. So when we lose ash on the urban landscape, we're reducing those great benefits that urban trees provide. It's also a valuable timber species. A lot of things can be made from ash wood, furniture, recreational products, building materials. So losing that species in the commercial forest declines the forest industry. And it's also a very common native species in our natural forests. So when we lose ash in our woodlands, we're losing habitat and food for tons of different wildlife species. As ash trees die, more sunlight is allowed to penetrate to the floor of the forest, and that opens up the canopy for invasive plants to thrive on the ground. And it also reduces all the environmental and recreational benefits of our natural forests. Treatments are available to protect individual trees. They're not effective on a large landscape level, so you can protect individual trees and keep them alive. So next pest on our list is gypsy moth. This one, Latin name is Lymantria dispar. It's a defoliating insect native to Europe, so it's a non-native invasive for us. It was introduced in Boston in the 1860s, and it was first detected in Ontario about 100 years later. It came here with a French naturalist. He brought it over from Europe and wanted to crossbreed it with a silkworm to create a silk industry in the States, and one of the gypsy moths escaped from his lab, and because it doesn't have its natural predators here, its population's exploded and now it's become invasive. Gypsy moth prefers to feed on oak trees. That's the species that it will go after first, but it will also attack birch, poplar, willow, maple, and many other hardwood species. It is well established in eastern Canada, including most southern, central, and eastern parts of Ontario, but also into Quebec and the Maritimes as well. And since gypsy moth has been on our landscape for many decades now, researchers have had the chance to study its population patterns over a long period of time, and they've observed that it has what they call a cyclical nature. So it goes through these boom and bust periods, and it'll experience population outbreaks about every 8 to 12 years. And usually each of these outbreaks will last between 2 and 4 years. So like emerald ash borer, gypsy moth will complete one full life cycle per year. It starts again with the eggs being laid in the late summer. The eggs overwinter on tree trunks or other surfaces throughout the winter. And the eggs are laid in these clumps. They're covered in fine hairs that helps to protect them from the cold and the snow. And each of these egg masses may contain up to 1,000 individual eggs. In the late spring or early summer, the eggs will hatch and the larvae will emerge, and they crawl up into the canopy to feed on the foliage. A fully mature gypsy moth larva is pretty easy to spot because you'll see it has these 6 pairs of red dots and 3 pairs of blue dots on its back and these long kind of orange hairs. So they're pretty noticeable in the canopy. And then in midsummer, once those larvae have finished feeding on the foliage, they create these cocoons for, they create these cocoons for themselves, they pupate, and then they emerge as adult moths about 2 weeks later. Signs and symptoms for gypsy moth, all 4 of the life stages are visible. So the best sign is direct evidence of the insect itself. You'll see the caterpillars, the eggs, the moths, all of it throughout the year. There's some sign that's visible. And then another sign is the defoliation that they cause in the canopy, especially affecting oak trees. Impacts of gypsy moth, like I mentioned, their outbreaks can last for a few consecutive years. And if it's only 1 or 2 years of defoliation, then that's usually okay. The trees can survive and they'll be fine. But if this is compounded by other stress factors, maybe there's drought or other environmental conditions, or if the outbreak is lasting more than 3 years, we can start to see tree dieback and mortality happening. Once we start to see this dieback and mortality, this means that we're losing those environmental and economic benefits. Another impact, although this is less severe in terms of tree health, is the nuisance factor that the caterpillars cause. They can be so severe, and they cover your deck, your driveway, your walkway. They make these surfaces slippery and messy, and they can ruin a hike pretty well because they'll cover you if you walk through gypsy moth infested woods. So they can make these experiences a little unpleasant. Okay, so we'll move on to a pest that is not as well established as those first two. This is the Asian longhorn beetle. In Latin, it's called Anoplophora glabra penis. And this is another insect, wood-boring beetle, just like emerald ash borer. It's non-native invasive and native to China and Korea. So this one was found for the first time in North America in the 1990s in the States. And then it was found in Toronto in 2003 and again in 2013 up near the airport. And just like emerald ash borer, we think it arrived here in wood packaging material. The preferred species of ALHB is maple, but it will also attack poplar, birch, and willow trees. And it'll go after both stressed and healthy trees as well. And the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which is the federal entity that regulates invasive pests in Canada, they are conducting surveys within this regulated area. That's the blue area near the airport. And they're also conducting surveys in nearby municipalities so they can make sure they detect any potential outlier populations to make sure this guy doesn't spread. The life cycle, ALHB will chew these pits in the tree to lay its eggs, and the eggs look like little tiny grains of rice. The eggs hatch in about 2 weeks, and the larvae start to feed on, again, the phloem tissue of the tree, and they dig deeper and deeper into the wood, creating these fairly sizable tunnels as they go along. The larvae mature into pupae in the early summer, and then they emerge as adult beetles in the midsummer. And the adults stay active until usually the mid or early fall. They're around and they're feeding on twig bark. They're flying around, usually on sunny days. On cloudy days, they're not as active. And they're pretty lazy, so they tend to stay around the same tree from which they emerged. Signs and symptoms, here we have a few photos. So the twig bark feeding is one. The other one that is pretty noticeable is their exit holes. So as the adults are emerging from the bark, they create these fairly sizable, perfectly round exit holes that are just smaller than the size of a dime. So they're pretty easy to see. The only visible life stage for this one is the adult beetle. So we can see them flying around, like I said, in the summer. And in many states in the US where there's active infestations, they actually have these posters, and it's a awareness campaign for people who have pools, because a lot of the times adults will end up in pools or skimmer baskets. So people are encouraged to check their pools in the summertime for evidence of Asian longhorn beetle as well. In terms of impacts, they're pretty severe. Once it's detected, all host trees within an 800-meter buffer of that detection site must be removed and then chipped or burned. And this includes trees on both public and private property. So you can see with this photo comparison that the effects, especially in the urban area, are quite devastating. And this can change the whole look of one neighborhood. So right now, removal is the only management option. Therefore, finding it early as possible is key to making sure that this pest does not spread. Okay, so now we'll move on to native insects, and the three we're going to talk about there is fall cankerworm, forest tent caterpillar, and spruce budworm. So we'll start with fall cankerworm, the Latin Alsophylla palmitaria. This is an insect and it's a defoliator. Just like gypsy moth, but this one is native to North America. It prefers Manitoba maple, American elm, but it'll also go after a variety of hardwood species, including ash, aspen, basswood, elm, and oak. This native pest is widely distributed through the southern half of the prairies, and it's also active in Ontario. So the maps that I'm showing you on the right of the screen, you can see these tiny little pockets. The Ministry of Natural Resources maps the populations of fall cankerworm in Ontario annually. And in the past decade or so, there's been very small pockets of defoliation, but the big map shows 2016 populations, and you can see that there's quite a wide spread of defoliation, especially around the Golden Horseshoe area in southern Ontario. Again, like gypsy moth, this pest is cyclical, so it'll have outbreaks usually every 10 to 15 years, but these ones will last a little bit shorter time, usually 1 to 4 years. And fall cankerworm lays its eggs in the winter. It creates these little clusters of eggs, and they're laid in very neat kind of geometrical rows. So they're pretty cool to see, but they're very difficult to see because they're so tiny and they camouflage very well with the bark. So you don't often see this part of the life cycle. The eggs will hatch in the late spring, and the caterpillars will come out. You might know these as inchworms. They're little green or brown caterpillars that inch their way up into the canopy, and they feed on the foliage and they grow. And when they're finished feeding, they drop down to the soil and they actually bury under the soil to pupate. And then they emerge as moths, usually in the late fall after a hard frost. The females and the males look very different. You'll see the top picture is of a female. They have no wings and they don't fly, but the males have wings and they do fly. And then they mate and they lay their eggs, and the cycle starts all over again. Again, like gypsy moth, the most obvious sign of fall cankerworm is the insect itself, but with this one, we can only see 2 of the life stages. Like I said, you probably won't see the eggs just because they're so tiny. You're more likely to see the larva and the moths. Although the female moths are quite difficult to spot because you see they camouflage quite well into the tree bark. And then also, like gypsy moth, the larvae feed on the foliage and can cause pretty severe defoliation. So that's another sign that we can look for. Fall cankerworm behaves very similar to gypsy moth. So generally they have the same impacts. They defoliate their host species, and then the caterpillars can cause a nuisance to the public as well. However, this one is not as often managed as gypsy moth. It's usually more tolerated on the landscape because it's native, and the population does typically collapse within 1 to 2 years. And so it doesn't have a chance to do too much damage. The next one is forest tent caterpillar, Melacosoma distria. And this is another defoliating insect, just like fall cankerworm and gypsy moth. It's native, but invasive. It prefers different host species depending on which part of the province you're in. So in northern Ontario, it prefers trembling aspen, poplar, and white birch. In southern Ontario, it prefers sugar maple and oak. It's pretty well established throughout the province, but definitely more common. We see it in the north. Again, same thing, this one has cyclical outbreaks every 10 to 12 years, but they last a little bit longer. So usually 3 to 6 years, you'll typically see the population peaking. And this one has been called the most widespread defoliator of hardwood trees in North America. So that's pretty significant. Biology of this one, it has a very similar life cycle to fall cankerworm and gypsy moth. So I won't spend much more time on it other than to say the larvae are pretty cool and easy to identify because you can see they have these stripes of blue and orange along their backs, and then these distinctive white keyhole patterns down their backs. So they're pretty cool to see. But in terms, the egg, larva, pupa, adult moth, same cycle. And the signs and symptoms of forest tent caterpillar, again, are very similar to the other defoliators we've already touched on. So you'll see the larva congregating on trees and on surfaces. You'll see the pupa and the moths flying around. And you'll also see defoliation of its preferred host species. Impacts, again, because it is very similar to these other defoliators, are the same. Like fall cankerworm, because it's a native species, it's usually more tolerated on the landscape, and managers will just kind of let it run its course. However, because the outbreaks can last longer, up to 6 years, management may be required if you want to keep trees alive and healthy, just because 6 years is a long time to sustain severe defoliation, and that would likely result in tree mortality. So intervention may be required in these longer outbreak scenarios.
Okay, so I'm going to now talk about spruce bedworm, which is Choristernura fumiferana. It is also a defoliator, which is native to North America. Its host is generally balsam fir, white spruce, black spruce, and red spruce. It follows the natural range of these species across Canada, so you can see that it's a pest in Ontario, but it's also a pest that's present nationwide. The outbreaks of this species are much further apart, with the cyclical outbreaks happening around every 30 to 40 years. And this pest in particular is considered the most destructive pest of spruce and fir forests in North America. So the life cycle of spruce bedworm begins with an egg. The female moths will lay the eggs on needles in clusters of 10 to 150 in August. The eggs hatch in the same month, and the first instar larvae emerge, and then they molt into the second instar larvae, where these larvae then travel down towards the interior of the crown, where they find a suitable overwintering location and create a silken shelter called a hibernacula to protect them over the winter. In the spring, the larvae will emerge, and they'll travel back out towards the new foliage at the tips of the branches, where they begin to feed on newly flushed needles. They then pupate in late June and early July, and then the adults emerge at the end of July, early August, where the entire process begins. So the signs and symptoms of spruce bedworm are basically the defoliation of the current shoots, as well as the larval nests. So you'll see this feeding that occurs from the top down, and it's pretty significant. You can see in the photo on the left all the dead twigs with the larval nest in the middle. When these populations reach a high outbreak level, you'll begin to see mortality and defoliation on the landscape. So as in the photo on the right, you'll see that the trees, as they begin to die, will turn a rust color, and with the defoliation as well, and these pockets will begin to grow around. Okay, so spruce bedworm impacts. At outbreak levels, it can cause serious economic impacts to the commercial forest industry. So there's a significant loss of merchantable timber on the landscape, and often when it reaches an outbreak level, it calls for management intervention. If the bedworm is causing 1 year of defoliation, it usually weakens the tree, but it won't kill it. But after repeated years of defoliation, then we see a significant loss in growth and mortality. It's also important to note here that even if the tree doesn't die, if we're talking about the commercial forest, if this defoliation is happening, then it may cause the tree to take on a non-normal growth, which then also contributes to unmerchantable timber. So it's also contributing to mortality, but also to non-natural straight growth of trees. The last outbreak that was recorded was between 1966 and 1992, and it affected about 50 million hectares of forest. And in 2013, the population was thought to be on the rise again, with about 3.2 million hectares in Quebec alone. And I just wanted to also point out, we don't have time, of course, today to talk about all the insects, but another major insect that is very similar in terms of life cycle and its effect on the forest is jack pine bedworm. And so it affects primarily jack pine and spruce, but it has a much shorter cyclical outbreak of 8 to 10 years. Okay, so we're now going to switch gears and talk about these three major diseases which are also affecting trees in Ontario. And we'll start with beech bark disease, which is the Neonectria faginata. This disease in particular is an insect disease complex. So it requires the feeding wounds of the non-native scale, which is called beech scale, or Cryptococcus phagisuga. And these beech scales create wounds on the tree, particularly in the tree bark. And these wounds create the openings to allow for the Nectria canker to get in and start doing its damage. So these cankers will get in under the bark, and the damage that they cause is in that sensitive phloem and cambium area. where it kills this area and eventually will girdle the tree, causing mortality. So the scale was first introduced into Halifax in the 1800s, and then has since then moved eastward and south throughout the Maritimes into Quebec, Ontario, and the eastern United States. And the primary or the host for this disease rather is American beech. So it's important to note that beech scale can be present for a long time with no evidence of the disease. So the disease requires the scale to be present, but the scale can be present with no disease. The scale itself is spread by wind, animals, and movement of beech wood. All of the scales are female. They are legless when they're adults, and they do not require a male to mate or produce eggs. The eggs are laid under the female body directly onto the surface of the bark, where they hatch, and the tiny crawlers or nymphs, they have legs at this point, and they move around until they find a suitable location on the tree. And when they find that location, they have what's called a piercing and sucking mouth part, and for them it's called a stylet. And they pierce the bark with their stylet and start to suck sap to feed. And when this happens, they molt into the next stage and they lose their legs. They become immobile, and then they develop that white woolly wax as they mature, and the process starts all over again. So is again just want to stress that it's these feeding wounds caused by the scale that allows entry of the fungus, not the other way around. So when the fungus enters the wounds, the cankers will develop, and you can see that those red dots that are on the tree in that photo in the zoomed in picture there, those are the cankers. And so both the scale and the pathogen can be transported by. Okay, so the signs and symptoms of beech bark disease, we can see in the crown some wilting and undersized foliage as the tree becomes stressed, the thinning crown, and then of course we can also see the scale. Most commonly when we see it, it'll have that white woolly wax on it, and so that's pretty evident on the tree. If we're looking for the disease in particular, it forms these lemon-shaped cankers, and if we're looking in the late summer and fall when the disease is active, we'll see these red marks on it, and those are the fruiting bodies of the canker itself. So you can see that in the photo there. And then as the cankers take hold and they start causing effect on the tree, they'll begin to sink into the bark, and then that's when you know that the disease is taking over. And the decline in mortality usually begins with the largest tree. So the impacts on the landscape: beech is an incredibly important wildlife tree on the landscape. It provides habitat for all kinds of wildlife, including birds and bats. In addition, it is an incredibly valuable food source for black bears in particular. So in addition to the wildlife aspects, it will also cause a reduction in valuable timber for commercial forest operations, as well as a reduction in biodiversity on the landscape. And in terms of impacts to humans, there's something called beech snap. And so when the trees get severely weakened like this, they can unexpectedly drop limbs. And so that can sometimes be a hazardous impact, when it's in a recreation area like a campground or maybe a hiking trail. Okay, so moving on to butternut canker. It is a pathogen that affects the cambial layer in trees. It is a non-native invasive in North America. It was first confirmed in Ontario not that long ago in 1991, but it was found sooner in Wisconsin in about 1967. The host for this is primarily butternut, but it can also be found in other members of the walnut family. The range of the disease follows the natural range of butternut in North America, and up to 90% mortality has been reported in the USA on the landscape in regards to this disease. And due to this disease, the butternut tree species itself has been listed as a species at risk in Ontario. Okay, so as far as this disease goes, unlike beech bark disease, which requires the specific feeding wounds of the scale, this disease can enter the tree through any kind of opening in the bark, whether it be from a bud or a leaf scar, an insect wound, a crack in the tree. Any kind of opening will allow entry for this pathogen. Typically, it will infect the small branches first, and then the spores are primarily dispersed by water. So as it rains or there's water events, the water will carry the spores down from the upper branches, down along the main stem of the tree, and therefore spreading the pathogen as well. And so you'll start seeing multiple cankers develop all over the tree, and eventually those cankers will brittle the tree and kill it. So as far as signs and symptoms go, unfortunately, this one is quite difficult to diagnose. It usually begins in the lower portion of the canopy, and you'll see some dieback and crown thinning. Sometimes you'll see some early spring cracks in the bark where you might see a leaking kind of symptom where you see this blackish fluid. But as these cankers kind of develop on the bark, often the tree will wall it off, and so sometimes that's also difficult to see. But if you do happen to see it, it will appear as like a black or a sooty kind of appearance on the bark, as you can see in the top photo. And if you were to cut away the bark from that sign, you would see a very distinct elongated oval shape underneath where the disease is taking hold and actually killing the phloem and the cambium under the bark. And in severe cases, it will also cause a reduction or even a cease in nut production. So that's also another thing to note. Okay, so the impacts of butternut canker is primarily the loss of species diversity and the loss of the species itself on the landscape. This is an incredibly devastating disease. So right now, as a result, it's listed as endangered in the province of Ontario and as a species at risk at the federal level. So it threatens the entire survival of this tree species itself. And like I said, the disease not only kills the tree, but it also causes a reduction or a loss in the production of nuts. So there are efforts being taken currently where we're collecting seed from trees that are showing any kind of resistance as an attempt to try to preserve the species. And the MNR also has a program where they will certify people to become butternut health assessors so that they can also work with identifying trees that may be remaining on the landscape. And just to kind of like bring this home to you, just one of the stats of the from the province is that they have 60 monitoring plots around the province, and within them there's 1,221 trees that are surveyed, and of those a total of 99.7% have been recorded as being infected with this canker.
Okay, now we're on to something that is not present in Ontario. The previous two diseases are already active and working their way through Ontario, but this one is not yet here. So this is oak wilt, and this is something that's on the horizon. It's a vascular disease caused by the fungus Bretziella fagacearum. This was first detected in the US in the 1940s, but it's probably been present since the late 1800s. The origin is unknown. So right now it's only present in the US and it's not known where it came from. It's not yet here in Canada, like I said, but it is close by. There's a positive detection on Belle Isle in the Detroit River, which is around 500 meters from Windsor, Ontario. And this detection was made in 2016. So it's definitely knocking on our door. As the name of the disease suggests, it's all oak species are susceptible to oak wilt. The red oaks are more susceptible, but all species are. And right now the CFIA is regulating the importation of all oak materials into Canada, and they're also doing surveys at high-risk sites, so areas of border crossings that have firewood disposal bins, campgrounds, or sawmills that are importing logs. In terms of how oak wilt spreads in its biology, it can be transmitted by 3 different methods. The first is natidulid beetles. They are attracted to the sap that will ooze out of an infected tree. That sap contains spores, and the beetles will get covered in those spores, and then they fly from the infection to a healthy tree. They're usually attracted to fresh wounds on healthy trees, so that's where they'll go, and then that's the entrance point for the disease. These natidulid beetles, you've probably seen them if you're ever out for a picnic and you have a slice of watermelon and you see these little black beetles flying around you. Those are natidulid beetles, so they're about. And the second way this disease spreads is underground through root grafts. Similar species will often fuse their roots together, so the disease can move from an infected tree to a healthy tree through the root system. And the third way that it can move is, of course, by humans moving infected oak wood between areas. So the most obvious symptom, of oak wilt is the leaves starting to wilt and brown early in the season. And they usually start to die from the tip of the leaf inwards, usually creating these kind of irregular, angular patterns of dead tissue as they go. And you'll see the leaves start to drop in July and August, which is not common for oak. In fact, oak species typically hang on to their leaves through the winter, even though they're dead. So if you start to see massive amounts of oak leaves dropping in the summer, then you know something's up. And another sign of oak wilt, but something that is not seen unless we go under the bark, are these fungal mats. It looks kind of like this discolored patch of of wood under the bark. And it emits this scent that people say smells like juicy fruit gum, which is pretty distinctive. In terms of impacts, the mortality from oak wilt is pretty drastic, and it can happen within one growing season, which is pretty intense. Red oak is especially susceptible, like I said, and sometimes within red oak, you can see decline in mortality even within 3 weeks, which is very quick. The pattern of mortality, you'll see this picture on the bottom right, it's called pocket mortality because you'll often see these pockets or these circles of dead trees, and that's a pretty distinctive feature of oak wilt mortality. In terms of impacts, it does impact all forest types in Ontario. In the commercial forest, it's a very valuable commercial species. It's also a very common street tree, so losing that species reduces the benefits of street trees in urban areas. And oak typically grows to be a very large, mature, nice street tree that provides a lot of shade and a lot of habitat and food for wildlife. So not only in the urban area, but also in the natural forest. And then just to wrap up, as Al mentioned, we did not have time to touch on all of the things that are posing threats to Ontario's forests. There's a lot out there and a lot that we wanted to cover, but we prioritized things that we thought were the most relevant threats to the forest right now. So if you're interested in additional research on this topic, we have hemlock woolly adelgid. That's more of a threat in the Maritimes currently, but we do have hemlock in our forests in Ontario. Mountain pine beetle, again, is mostly on the west coast, but marching its way eastward. Pine shoot beetle, European elm scale, Dutch elm disease is present and throughout Ontario and has been for decades. Thousand cankers disease. And then the last one, just to quickly touch on, is abiotic diseases. And Al mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that there were two different types of diseases. Biotic, which is what we have focused on. Biotic diseases are caused by living agents. Abiotic diseases are caused by non-living agents. So things like weather, drought, soil compaction, poor soils, salt damage, wildfires, extreme weather, ice storms, snowstorms, conflicts with construction projects, vandalism, mechanical damage due to lawnmowers or weed whackers. All of these things are abiotic factors that negatively impact tree health in all forest types. So we wanted to just bring those to light as well as something to consider as a threat to Ontario's forests. And with that, we will conclude our part of the presentation. I think, Diana, you're going to let us know if there's any questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Alison Whittle and Alison Craig. That was really good. At this point, I would like to go forth with the Q&A. There are a few questions here that I have for you. But before I begin addressing those questions, I actually have a question myself. Back when you were talking about the emerald ash borer, I'm not sure if I missed this, but did you mention what are the best methods for eradication or management for the EAB?
Yeah, so eradication of this one unfortunately doesn't look like it's a possible management strategy. It just moves too fast. It is too populous. So it's very difficult to eradicate this pest altogether, but there are methods of protecting your forest. mostly on the individual tree level. There are treatments available. So these are vaccinations that you can give to the tree early on in the infestation, or as early as possible. And that can help to protect your tree throughout the emerald ash borer infestation. You want to administer those treatments, like I said, as early as possible. So ideally before you start to see those signs and symptoms that I talked about. I'd say that's the best method of keeping ash on the landscape.
Okay. When you say vaccinations, do you mean like pesticides or insecticides?
Yeah, there's a variety of insecticides and bioinsecticides that are available. And the other thing I should mention is biocontrol. This is something that the federal government is working on, finding parasitic wasp species that will parasitize the eggs of emerald ash borer and control the population that way. So research is being done on that, and that's a hopeful way of controlling the population in the future, so that we can maybe save some ash in the natural forest as well.
Okay, so my follow-up question is, these vaccinations that we use for the emerald ash borer, what kind of effect do they have on surrounding trees?
So because they are administered directly into the tree that you want to protect, it's called micro-injection technology, and you're essentially drilling a hole into the tree and administering the biopesticide that way. It has no effect on the surrounding trees. It is just effective on the tree that you inject it in.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so a few more questions that we have. First question is, are invasive species harmful to humans?
That's a good question. The first thing that comes to my mind on that topic is gypsy moth in particular. The hairs of the larva, I'm sure you saw the hairs in that picture, they're quite long, and they can cause allergic reactions in humans. So if you touch the hairs, or there's a caterpillar crawling on you, you can get a skin reaction or inflammation directly at that site. It doesn't happen to everybody. It seems that just some people are susceptible to that. But that's definitely one human health interaction for sure. And then I would just say that the impacts to human health can be felt kind of indirectly as you lose that tree canopy, that valuable tree canopy in urban areas, especially. You're losing shade, you're losing the tree's ability to mitigate air pollution. So all of those things will affect human health as well. Okay,
thank you. Next question is, what is the annual economic cost of invasive forest pests in Canada, or specifically Ontario?
Ooh. That's a good question. I actually just saw a handout on this from the Invasive Species Center, so I apologize, I don't have it with me, but the Invasive Species Center has recently done a bunch of surveys of Ontario municipalities, so I think it might just be the cost of invasive species in urban areas, but if you go to their website, they have numbers on how much municipalities are spending on controlling invasive species.
Yeah, I know it's a lot of money, but I couldn't give you a number either.
Yeah.
There's also, I had in the presentation with regards to spruce budworm, that Canada's annual timber losses due to invasives are estimated at 61 million cubic meters, which is equivalent to about $720 million. And that was according to the Canadian Action Plan for Invasive Alien Terrestrial Plants and Plant Pests. So there's a numerical fact for you.
Thank you. Okay, I think this is the last question. It's, how can I help to stop the spread of invasive species if I see one in person?
That's a great question. I would say that if you see, particularly there's invasives that we, in areas that we know that they exist, and then there's in areas that we don't know that they exist. So Asian longhorn beetle, for example, it hasn't been detected in Ontario since it was 2013, I believe. So if you were to see that beetle, then the first thing that you should do is to call the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. to let them know. And often invasives are found by residents, by local people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do you have anything to add there, Alison? Or?
Yeah, I would just say the CFIA is the body that regulates all the invasive pests. So if you have anything that, was on our list, not all of them are regulated by CFIA, but they would be the first point of contact. If you have something that looks particularly interesting, it's always good if you can to collect it safely. So if you've got rubber gloves and tweezers and you're able to pick that caterpillar or pick that beetle up and put it in a collection jar, record, the address or where you found it, even what city you found it in. The more information that CFIA has, the better. So that would be a great way of reporting it. In terms of stopping the spread, there are a few kind of control mechanisms that we can implement for species that are in the urban area. For example, gypsy moth. If you see those egg masses on the tree, you can scrape them off into a cup of soapy water, and that will kill the larva inside. So that's one way to kind of reduce the population. It really just works on a local level. It's not a wide landscape level control mechanism, but if you're looking to just protect the trees in your backyard, then that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and the other thing is firewood. Is not to move firewood. So often people will go camping or go to their cottage and will bring their own firewood. But if you've got a tree that died from an invasive in your yard and you cut it down for firewood, often those spores can remain viable for a long time, or the insects, in the case of emerald ash borer, they can hide underneath the bark and be not visible to our eyes. And then we're unknowingly transporting these to an area that may not have had them before. So, getting your firewood locally and burning it where you got it is always a good practice as well.
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, is there anything we can do to prepare for oak wilt?
That's a great question. The more eyes that are looking for it, the better. So looking for those signs and symptoms, and if you see them, report them right away to CFIA. Like I said, the transmission above ground occurs when the natigulid beetles take the spores from an infected tree to a healthy tree. And the most common way that they will be attracted to a healthy tree is on fresh wounds. So the most effective way that we can protect our oak trees from getting infected above ground right now is to not prune the oak trees during the period where those natigulid beetles are active. And that's usually from April to October. So not cutting oak trees during that time is probably the number one way to prevent transmission. We don't really know how far the natigulid beetles can fly, so just being safe and not pruning between that window is our best bet.
Okay, thank you. So I think that wraps up our Q&A session. I'd just like to take this time to once again thank you, Alison Windmill and Alison Craig. Thank you everybody who participated and asked questions. They're all really good questions. And I hope you guys all have a great weekend. And if at this point you guys don't have anything else to say, I guess we can go ahead and end the session.
Thanks so much, Diana.
Great. Yeah. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everyone.